My name is Ron Axelson, and my question, I think, is directed at Peter and what's happening in Boulder. When you talk about limiting the growth, and then you talked, it seemed to me there was a conflict between, you said there were more jobs than there was housing. And to me, if you don't have growth, a kind of stagnation will set in, and then the economy, if you're not growing, then stagnation turns into, regression. And I'm really curious how this formula is working, where you have more jobs than housing when you're limiting the growth of a city. It just, to me, intuitively, it just doesn't make any sense.
Sure, thanks for that question. I think what I want to do is distinguish between the physical growth of a community versus the economic vitality of a community. And I think Boulder is a good example that those two things are not necessarily equated. So we have limited the extent of our annexations and bringing new land into the community, and basically created a compact city. But that compact city is quite vibrant, and we have had this substantial job growth, which frankly from a planning perspective is more than a bit of a problem relative to regional development patterns. We had a mayor who said every time we add a job to Boulder and don't provide housing, we're contributing to regional sprawl. And I think that is true. And so if you take that regional perspective, as we grow our jobs and don't provide that good housing, people are living in other communities and commuting in and putting stress on our freeway system, and that's part of the reason that we're so interested in transit and developing that new system. I don't have the figures offhand, but I can think of parcels in my 30 years of living there that have developed once, twice, even 3 times, redevelopment cycles. Coming into Edmonton from the airport certainly looked like a great deal of opportunities, let's put it that way, for infill and redevelopment. So I think all cities have this resource of land that is underutilized. And with investment in those kinds of areas providing appropriate infrastructure, I don't sense, at least in this economic cycle or my lifetime, that there's really a need to expand land in Boulder to maintain that vitality.
Thanks. Richard, did you want to offer comment? Your pass? Yeah, okay. Your question.
Good.
There we go. On now.
Yeah. Barry Clayton, I farm in the Calgary area. Question is directed to Laura. I visited in the Markham-Stoffel area last summer and was quite impressed by the open spaces and the green areas in there, and I was interested in your comments about the citizens of Markham being quite keen on preserving that area. My question is just how did you go about compensating the landowners of that property, or did you purchase the property? How did you go about having society having input into making that a reality, that there would be green space within certainly a large amount of urban development, primarily residential?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. There is no compensation. Given the planning regime that we have in Ontario, there is an expectation that the province can say what you can do with your land. And this is very different, I think, than many other places, with this sense that, for the most part, we feel like we're all in this together. And not to quote High School Musical, but we really are all in this together. So the province identified the Greenbelt Plan area, the protected countryside, in areas that they felt were far enough away that they weren't subject to a great deal of land speculation yet. So they were owned by farmers for the purposes of farming. They weren't owned by speculators that still were being farmed by farmers. And so the land values were agricultural land values, and so putting the Greenbelt Plan in place didn't, in theory, although some people have started to study that a little bit more. But in theory, the land values have stayed the same, so you didn't need to compensate people for that. And it was a big problem. I mean, farmers drove their tractors down to Queen's Park, where the provincial government sits. You can imagine in rush hour in the morning, because tractors don't move very fast, and drove down to Queen's Park and said, we don't actually like the way that you have come in and set this land use planning on us because you're restricting what we can do. And yet the province, because of the way that we do planning, had every right to do that.
Okay, thank you. And next question.
Hi there. My name is Dave Anderson. I'm a councillor out in Strathcona County. We cover a lot of the industrial heartland for the area. I have two questions, actually, and maybe this would be for Mr. Bullock. I grew up in BC. I'm very familiar with the agricultural land reserve out there, and I toiled in those class 4 or 5 soils in orchards, and my first job was actually in an orchard, so I appreciated where your sentiments there. My question is how much class 1 soil is there actually out in, and this might be too big of a question for you, but in the world?
It's way too big a question for me.
Okay.
I haven't got a clue.
And I apologize, but could we, is it like I've heard it's in around the 10% of the world's soil, that there is only about 10% of it actually at a class 1.
You could be right.
Okay. Is there anyone on the panel that can answer that question?
Can I Google it?
Sorry?
If I look at my iPhone, I can Google it.
Okay.
Okay, having gone there,
but
now
having,
what?
yeah, what's the?
Now what?
I guess the next question that I had then is if class 1 soil is removed from its initial spot, can it be reused elsewhere? With the same effectiveness?
I would say probably not.
Okay.
But that's not to say that that's better than burying it. You know, we do in our province, and under our legislation, we do look after land, and if there is development and it's on good land, the topsoil is removed and it's used somewhere else, and that's not the best case scenario, but it does happen. And that's least preferable. Generally, it's class 1 land is in river valleys, deltas, you name it. Not only does it have the land that's involved, but it has the climate and the water and all the rest of those sorts of things. So, not an easy question. And for Alberta and ourselves with the booming oil and gas industry, one of our major concerns is up in the Peace River area, where we have huge activity on probably some of the best agricultural land in our province, and we're constantly up there working and yipping and bitching at the oil and gas industry, if I can put it nicely, to look after the land that they are screwing up. And it's our intention that if you're going to operate on that land, you operate it on a fashion that when you're finished, because you will be finished, that you can put it back and keep it in its original use. Having said all that, we're in the middle of a big relook or rethink of our legislation, and there's some within government that think we're being unreasonable. I don't think we are, because this is pretty special stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Little known factoid about class 7 land in BC is actually above the snow line, and that's where our frozen orange juice comes from. I just thought you'd want to be illuminated on that. Your question.
Hi, my name is Larry Simpson, and I've been kind of interested in this whole subject area for a long time, and I want to just share with you some observations that I've been making and get your feedback to see if my thinking's correct or off track or not. But when the agricultural land reserve, back up a second, politicians are generally going to do what they have or perceive they have political support for. And when the agricultural land reserve came in, as you pointed out, Richard, there was a lot of very unhappy people in agriculture. But they could do it politically, because I'm guessing probably 90% of the population was urban, and they were quite happy to have these surrounding areas left as open space. So there was a political driver there that made it possible. Peggy, I'm just, Laura rather, I'm guessing the Greenbelt situation had 91% support, but I'm guessing a disproportionate amount of that was probably urban. I'm just guessing. Whereas if we were to try and exercise a similar type strategy in Alberta, would be more challenging, because a higher proportion of the electorate here is rural. And so it's not to say that I won't, not a fan of what you've done or anything. It's just to say that the realities may be a little different, and the plans the way we'd have to go about it might be a little different. It's very interesting that Boulder has reached out and just said, we're going to expand our green space from a tax base of an urban center. It's a very, very, very interesting approach. But the approach I've kind of long advocated that might be politically palatable here would be one where we have something driven by financial incentives, because it's primarily an agricultural land base, and the notion of a takings of property rights or value would probably be strongly resisted. It's just a guess and an observation, but I'd like your feedback.
You want me to Richard?
Sure, go ahead.
You look like you're ready
This
to jump
sounds
in.
like a discussion we've had around our kitchen table. It's one that's real, but having said that, I think trying to relate one area to another, you've got more agricultural land probably in the city of Edmonton that we've got in the whole Okanagan Valley. We don't have any, and I think I'm surprised there's this many of you left in Edmonton today. They're normally all in Kelowna. But
It's the shoulder season.
yeah, it is the shoulder season. But if it wasn't for the ALR, I don't think you'd see a vital agricultural industry either in the Lower Mainland or in the Okanagan, and I suggest Laura probably wouldn't in the Niagara Peninsula and that sort of area. When I'm out here and I see your vast spaces, you've got a different set of circumstances. It's how you keep it active. That's the real part. And the one thing that has changed, and I think both my colleagues here have mentioned it, I would not have given you 10 years ago to see farmers markets in the Okanagan. Local food has become important. And food, just so some of you know, I farm about 4,000 acres in Chile, so I'm sending you a lot of food as well as the Okanagan. That food is becoming less and less available to us. So it's bloody important that we can produce as much as we can of our own, because I've watched my business over the last 30 years offshore. What's coming into North America and Europe has reduced substantially. The rest of the world is growing, the middle class is growing, and they want exactly what you and I want. And they want the same quality, they want the abundance, and they want it today, and they're prepared to pay for it. We better start thinking of that. For us in this part of the world, in North America, I think we're dreaming. We're walking along thinking we're the best. We are falling behind in the production of our food. California, huge problem in California. Your part of the world is getting paved over. My part of the world, as much as we are helping, it's disappearing faster than we can blink. So I hear you. You're in Alberta, we're in BC, you're in Ontario, you're in Boulder. Your conditions are different, but by God, agriculture is important, and keep that land. That land, you cannot be in agriculture if you don't have land. And in my part of the world, we don't have a lot of it. And we have absolutely none to waste.
Thank you for your question.
Can I
Oh, and
comment
sorry,
on that?
yeah,
I want to say a couple of things. The first one is that I hope that not for one moment anybody in the room thought that I meant what we were doing in Ontario would be what you would do in Alberta, because I can't think of two different places, quite frankly. So just it has to be a locally a locally made decision. It has to make sense locally for the kinds of issues that you have. One thing that I can clarify, though, is the idea of takings, is that what was taken in the case of the Greenbelt was an idea of a future payoff if a farmer's lands were going to be urbanized. And so what changed was the retirement plans of a lot of the farmers. And it wasn't a present day taking. The land values stayed the same. It was a future taking and something that, you know, could kind of potentially happen, but wasn't necessarily proven. When I was saying that the Greenbelt Plan is a land use plan, is that what has to happen at the same time is the change in tax, is the change in the kind of things you can do on a particular farm, like what kind of value-added things can you do. And so that's actually changing with our provincial policy statement, because they realize that, you know, you can't have a working landscape just based on commodities and crops, because it fluctuates way too much. So, and then the other part, I was kind of careful not to talk about it, which is the, you know, kind of bleeding heart liberal versus the individualist conservative, and kind of not to go there. But the idea that what I do on my land is my own business, and I'm going to be the best steward of that, versus you coming in, especially from the urban area, and telling me what to do on my land. I mean, that just doesn't work. So having the farmers, having the rural municipalities and the rural people with the social capital to say, you know, look, if we look out over 50 years, this area is really going to be growing. What do you want for your grandchildren? What do you want that to look like? And how do you think you can participate in that? And quite frankly, it has to be a top-down, we have the province, but a region, and not something that's voluntary, because there's always going to be those couple of people who think that they're going to do something different, and then they end up switching the market. And so it really does have to be something with teeth from a planning policy point of view.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yes, my question is directed to any of the speakers, specifically to suitability, land suitability for agriculture. I'd like to now give some context to where my question is from. Ron McNeil, Landwise. The issue of using the Canada Land Inventory is that it's old, it's archaic, and it's not defensible. And I think that all municipal members here today, for example, need to know that there's another product called the Land Suitability Rating System that was generated in the 1990s in Canada and is specifically for different types of agricultural crops. So for those on the panel, what measures do you use for defensibility, and how can you do that to avoid, you know, big litigation issues, but making it more streamlined, making it more recognizable for the different players, the stakeholders, when there's important land use decisions that involve whether it's agricultural being moving from one designation to another or seeking to better protect it.
I'll do just a quick answer. Obviously, it's not specific to this context, but when we would look at the question of areas that were appropriate to expand our service area or to preserve for planning purposes long term, we use this tool, land use suitability analysis, and I think, you know, the glib answer is you use your best available information. And so if that's available to you, that's the best way to go. For the time we did our initial analysis for Colorado, it had to do with soil types and the availability of irrigation. So, I mean, a big feature, obviously, in the eastern plains of Colorado is whether you have water available or not. So those were the kind that we use state designations to do that. Ultimately, that was adopted through a legislative process. So the city and the county together said these were the appropriate places for us to expand based on a whole number of features. There were probably about a dozen different layers to that geographic information system type of mapping. And so they were able to adopt that legislatively. And so that never became an issue per se in terms of any litigation by property owners.
I could go on all day on this one because it has changed, and the designation of 1 to 7 was put in back in the 60s, and when they were putting our boundaries in initially, that's all they had. Today we have a far better suite of tools that we're using, land inventory and suitability and climate and all the rest, all comes into it. We've also got 40,000 plus applications that we've dealt with over the years as we can draw on, and decisions that we've made from there. So it's it's not easy, but we take everything into consideration when we look at it. And it depends, a big issue is climate. What are we talking about? Where are we? Are we in the Peace River? Are we in the Chilcotin Flats? Are we in the Okanagan? There's a whole different suite of things we use. So it goes way beyond 1 to 7. 1 to 7 is used primarily by the applicant who wants to get their land out. I'll be frank, not many of us use that any longer.
We have time for one last quick question.
Quick question. My name is Gail Langford. I'm going to speak from the perspective of the Red Deer Chamber of Commerce and our Ag Policy Committee, which is very, very active. You've pulled together some threads. We've been told that by 2020, Canada will be one of 6 net food exporters, with most of that coming from Saskatchewan and Alberta. Our membership talks a lot about agricultural operations. And so planning isn't just about land. Planning is also about having marketing facilities and transportation. So we've talked a lot about land, but I'd like to kind of pull that together and your comments about how do we not just preserve and protect land, but have planning that takes into account the transportation corridors that agriculture needs, that the marketing facilities, the processing facilities are all considered in those planning contexts. So I don't really, I'd like to hear the panel kind of pull that together. Thank you.
So that was why I was so excited about what was going on in Sacramento, because I think when I think about urban planning, it's not just about the land, right? It's about what are we going to put on the land. When I talk about jobs, housing balance, it's about how much economic activity, what kinds of jobs, what kind of housing needs. When I think about land use planning, it's also about transportation planning. You can't make a city function without thinking about its transport. So applying the same kind of thinking to agricultural land to me seems very kind of provocative and a really nice lever to the whole question. And so if you look at the kinds of activities they're doing at SACOG, it touches on the areas that you're talking about. How do we make sure that we have safe routes for people to get goods from field to market, those kinds of things. So there's a very long list they have. I won't belabor it, but just encourage you to look at that as a great model for doing exactly what you're talking about, which is to look at the whole package of agricultural land preservation, not just the parcel, but what goes on top of it.
Thank you, Peter. Laura, did you have a brief comment?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of things. Is that one thing I like a lot about planning is that it does try to think of all of the potential influences or outcomes of a particular plan. And so certainly in terms of the Greenbelt Plan, when it came into place, there was a lot of consideration for where that food was going and for whom. And it's come in the 10 years since the plan's been in place, there's really 2 aspects of it. So one, what's the market, the urban market that's quote unquote local food? And we have a local food movement which has basically gone out and found champions. Star chefs especially seem to be ones who can move a lot. And we have soup fests and with our Winterlicious, a lot of the restaurants weren't getting a lot of people in the winter, so we have a Winterlicious program where the restaurants say that they'll only use local food, which ironically in the winter has to be one of the most difficult times you can do it. So you get a lot of, parsnip soup and stuff. Anyway, but so there's that local food connection and how you make the direct connection between the producers and the existing urban market close by, except as most of you know, where the larger farm market is in the global commodity chain. And so people are going to those gatekeepers at the commodity chain and saying, okay, what is it? Where does this food go? What are we doing? And then trying to look at rationalizing that in a way that makes more sense. So I think that there's actually two things. And I showed the transportation network. That's really, it's goods and services. I mean, people getting to work is the last thing on the province's mind in some ways. And trucking, rail is hugely important.